important in England. For others, they don't need a king. They don't want a king. And they'd rather there not be a king. How about we do away with the monarchy? So there's a lot of turmoil in there. But when we think about the king, and he doesn't really have power to punish. If somebody says, I don't like the king, he can't call on his guards to go and arrest anybody. He doesn't have that power. How do you honor the king is a question they have to do, because he has a fake sort of power. And as people in the United States, we kind of dealt with that sort of thing quite a while ago, because we didn't want a king. And so we think, okay, some people, again, Facebook is an indicator. There's all kinds of feelings about that. Some of them, not my king, I don't care. Or the queen was a good lady and all that. So people have different ways of interacting with the royalty of the world. But this king, the current king of England, really doesn't have power. He's kind of there. And I think that's a very important concept for us to have. That he's got the crown, he's got the duties of showing up at the right places, but he doesn't have authority in England. And there are some areas of our life that we have elevated, some powers in our life, some powers in this world that we have elevated to a place of authority when in fact they're not the real authority. There are different ideas and different morals that are coming up in our culture as the culture is turning over. And we're trying to figure out, how do we fit in this culture where who knows who gets to make the rules? Who gets to say what morality is what? Because growing up, we assumed that people would go to the Bible and find out what the morality was. And we know it wasn't universal, but in America it was common. But now people are coming up with morals from different places with different ideas. But how do you honor the cultural powers? And do we honor them? And I want us to look in Colossians. We're still in chapter 1. Keep reading through Colossians every week. Before we do this, I want us to think about who is the king and how do we honor him? Because there are some who have taken power who are not the king. There are some in our culture, some ideas and thoughts and philosophies that are authoritative because people are judged. You are judged whether or not you follow the cultural values of morality and sexuality and all the different things. And we receive this burden of judgment by ideas that are not from God. And when we read Colossians, it was that very sort of environment they experienced. Only they had an actual king, the emperor of Rome, who did have power to punish and to kill. And did have power. And those acting on behalf of the king, the emperor of Rome, had the ability to come in and just destroy the churches, imprison the Christians, and they had no recourse. And in that culture, in the neighborhood, in this letter to Colossae, in their neighborhoods, they would have neighbors who had They would have neighbors who had little statues of Caesar, not Little Caesars, but that's different, but little statues of Caesar in their house among their household gods, sitting there, and they would worship him. There would be parades down the street in honor of Caesar, and incense would be offered to Caesar, and sacrifices would be offered to Caesar, and they'd say, this is how you honor the king. If you don't like him, it doesn't matter. You need to honor him. You need to offer the things and say, what is the phrase? Caesar is Lord. And then Christians had to choose. Am I going to say Caesar is Lord or Jesus is Lord? Am I going to say Caesar is the ruler of the empire and he's in charge of everything that goes on, or Jesus is really the king? In that culture, it was a very distinct choice to be made with actual economic consequences. You could lose your job. You could get kicked out of your organization if you were a blacksmith and the blacksmiths worshipped whatever god and Caesar, and you refused to go and worship that god. You could quit being a worker, quit getting money coming in. You would be ostracized by the community because you don't believe right. So there were some, and that was a struggle in the first century for the churches to decide, how do I as a Christian make a living in this economy that honors Caesar and and other deities? And how do I honor Jesus at the same time? How do I honor the king? That was a legitimate question they had. And when Paul's writing this letter, he has to deal with this. And see, in the United States, our fake king seems to have no power, and yet the ideas of our culture are very influential on Christians. We are pulled to agree with the immoralities of the world. We are pulled to get along with the people who have forsaken true worship of God because it's easier and more comfortable. How do you honor the king is a legitimate question for the people in Colossae in the first century and for us in Chickasha, Oklahoma today. Because we've got to honor our king in a way that is true. So Paul is writing to them in that sort of circumstance, encouraging the faithful to Christ to truly be faithful. And he starts off by saying, let's look at how things are. Let's look at how the world works. I want you to know that you give thanks to the Father. Why do we give thanks to the Father? Let me tell you what the Father has done. He's qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. And he has delivered us from the domain of darkness, from the authority of darkness, from the power of darkness. There is another kingdom, another realm on this earth, and it's a dark one. It's one that chooses its own morality to destroy the fabric of society, to dissolve the relationships of marriages. There is a domain of darkness from which God has delivered us, our Father. And we've got to know that, because if we're not aware that there is a darkness and there is another option, then we can function in this world not understanding that we have turned our back on the God who delivered us and go right into the shadows, because it's easier and more comfortable to agree with the darkness than to stand out and be isolated as one who's been transferred into the kingdom of the beloved Son. And in this kingdom that we're going to talk about, we have a king. How do we honor this king? First off, we've got to recognize there is a difference between light and dark. The domain of the beloved Son and the powers of darkness in this world. And the powers of darkness don't want to admit they're dark, so they claim to be light and claim that the teachings of Christ are dark. And we will hear that, and you might see it if you're a Facebook reader and peruse Facebook. You see, how can Christians call themselves Christians and whatever? And everybody, it's a name-calling thing. Facebook is pretty much like junior high. All the name-calling, all the we're friends, we're not friends, it's junior high. And unfortunately, I think the same thing about American politics at the national level. The name-calling, the painting a picture of one-sided, every issue is politically, well, it's all this, it's all hate. Well, no, you're full of hate. Well, no, you're full of hate. And they're yelling, it's junior high. But we're called to Christ. I'm sorry, it bothers me every time I see it, because we're called out of the kingdom of darkness with the name-calling, with the floating morality that changes day to day and week to week. We are called into the kingdom of the beloved Son. And this is very important if we think back to the situation where their neighbors are having these parties in honor of Caesar, and these idols worshiping Caesar, and the incense to Caesar and sacrifices. It's a constant bombardment of a false king who has real power over them. And Caesar is known as a god or a son of the gods, and he is very important. But Paul says, do you know who the true king is? This beloved Son, we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Because this beloved Son, he's the image of the invisible God. He's not like that statue on your neighbor's shelf. He truly is the image of God, living and breathing and acting. and working in this world. We have a living Savior, a living King, a living Christ, a living Messiah, a living shepherd. He's not an idea. He's not a philosophy. He's not a picture. He is a living being who is truly representative of the living God. And those things your neighbors are worshiping are not the true image. They're just little statues. He's the firstborn of all creation. And when it says firstborn, it means the status. He is the oldest son. He is the one who gets the inheritance. He's the one on whom all the power goes. Just like in England, there's a line of succession from the king and the next king and the next king. And Jesus is right there with God. He has that position. In all of creation, he is the one that gets to be the king. By him, all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authority. All things were created through him and for him, and that includes Caesar over in Rome, and that includes the governor over Colossae. That includes all the leaders in the community were created by him and through him and for him, and God knows what he's doing. Now, you might not know it by looking at them. They are wicked. They are selfish. They are destructive. But Jesus is king over all of them. Jesus is king over all the leaders of the United States of America. Jesus is king. He is so far above all of that. Whatever power somebody claims to have, Jesus is above that sort of power. Therefore, Jesus has not only the power, but the authority to declare what is right and what is wrong. He has the authority to tell us what is love and what is hate. He has the authority to tell us what is sin and what is righteousness. He has the authority to tell us what is good and what is evil, because we have been transferred out of the kingdom of darkness, where that all gets changeable, into the kingdom of the beloved Son, where everything is under him. So we need to not let ourselves be confused by the teachings of darkness, but to honor Christ as the true King and listen to his teachings of right and wrong, moral and immoral. He's the King. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. Whatever your neighbors might think or say, Christ is the one who's the King. So to honor the King, first off, we have to recognize who is the King. And we see that Jesus is King whether the darkness recognizes him or not. Jesus is the King whether Caesar believed in him or not. Jesus is the King whether the neighbors made fun of you or not. Jesus is the King, and we need to decide if Jesus is the King you serve. Because he is the true King, but you have a choice to drift back into the domain, the authority of darkness again. You have the ability and opportunity to turn your back on the Father who transferred you into this kingdom, and King Jesus who welcomed you with open arms and the blood of forgiveness. And we here in Chickasha, Oklahoma need to start making those choices every day. Whether we are going to listen to the King who is preeminent and authoritative, or let other authorities of darkness who don't really have power influence our minds and our hearts and our words and our lives and our actions. It's more comfortable that way to just go along with the culture, to let culture teach us what the Bible should say. But if Jesus is King, you're going to want to know what the King does say. Because he is constant, and he is saving, and he is loving, but he's also judging. So recognize who is the king. And then when you recognize who is the king, you have to decide, is that the king I've chosen to serve? Or have you chosen yourself as a king? Or have you chosen your culture as a king? Or your political party as a king? Who have you chosen as your king to follow? Is it Jesus? Or have you deceived yourself and drifted back in the darkness? That's a question Paul had for the church there. Because in Jesus, in him, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on heaven or in heaven or on earth. He's bringing everything together, making peace by the blood of his cross. He's truly king. But have you turned to have another king? Paul said, please don't do that. Don't turn away from the one who has saved you by his blood. Don't turn away from the one who knows that sin destroys you from the inside out. What's so wrong with the kingdom of darkness? Well, the kingdom of darkness is like a cancer that eats us away from the inside. The sin that we allow in us when we say God must not know what he's talking about sexual morality. God doesn't know what he's talking about anger and envying. God doesn't know what he's talking about with greed. I think I can do this. And we're being destroyed from the inside out because that's what sin does. God does not make arbitrary rules just because he likes to make rules. God knows what destroys us and says, don't do that, you're being destroyed. Turn away from that. Choose the king that you follow to be Jesus. Because once you were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, was that like a long time ago, or was that yesterday or this morning? One of the things about living in this world is our righteousness can be eroded. Our determination to turn away from immorality can just be dissolved by the constant bombardment of immorality on movies and on TV and on advertisements and on social media. And there's a constant bombardment of immorality that pretty soon makes it seem normal and okay. And in fact, in our culture, it becomes so normal that it's wrong to say it's wrong. But people who have disagreed where God clearly says what is right and what is sinful, and we say, no, that's not really a sin. Now we have become hostile to God. So you not only have to decide if Jesus is your king, you're going to have to decide, am I going to follow Jesus, or am I going to have to follow the kingdom of darkness and pretend to follow Jesus? I can still sing Jesus is Lord, but is your heart serving Jesus as Lord? Is your mind pure from lust, from pornography, from divisiveness, from bitterness? Is your mind one that's ready to forgive? Or are you holding on to some stuff? Have you heard God's command to turn towards righteousness and become hostile to God, doing evil deeds? As Paul's writing, he said, that's what you used to do. But now, he has reconciled in his body of flesh by his death in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. Because if you're going to go see the Caesar, you need to make sure you're wearing the right clothes. Make sure you're invited. Make sure you have enough money to go and see him and get in front of him and all that. That's the way it works with kings on earth. You've got to make yourself ready, and you've got to make the connections, the political connections, and all that to be able to stand in front of Caesar. And Jesus says, I've done all that for you because I want you to come close. How do you honor that? You let him clean you up. You let your mind become purified. Let your heart become pure. If indeed you continue in the faith, you can stand before him blameless and above reproach. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all heaven and under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister, that he writes this. But see, the pressure is great to compromise on God's morality. The pressure is great to decide that what God has called sin, it doesn't feel wrong. The darkness is attractive because we can hide in it in comfort. But the blood of Jesus is powerful where we can stand before God in purity. So, how have you been honoring the King? Do you recognize him in his greatness, in his holiness? Are you ready to stand before him and let him make you holy and blameless, washed and cleansed, transformed and renewed, purified in your thoughts and in your words, forgiven of your sins, standing there praising the true King who is over all? Or do you need to come back out of the darkness again? Because in your mind and in your heart, you've let the culture around you influence you to be okay with sin, with lust, with greed, with divisiveness and arguments, with grudge holding and not forgiving. And you need to honor the King by coming out of that darkness again so you can live in the kingdom of light. You have a King. Jesus is King and Lord. But have you been serving him as King and Lord, or do you have another king, whether it's yourself or something else, that you need to walk away from into the kingdom of the beloved Son? Do you need to be baptized into Christ? And Paul talks about that in what we call chapter 2, continuing the letter. Putting off the old self and putting on the new self, being baptized, going down the water to come up to have this new self, this new life, this new King. And you need to do that today. You need to put him on and live for him. Or you just need prayers to help you stay out of the darkness. Please let us know when we stand and we sing this next song.
There's a fountain, 'tis for you.